Okay, I chose this setting months ago so I could talk about this story. I haven't talked about a single story in quite a while, but here we have uh, the door to the underworld. Over here we have a clock with no hands on it, which may come into play later, who knows. I'm going to talk about the Shadow Kingdom, King Kull's story. Robert E. Howard's King Kull, the Shadow Kingdom, published in Weird Tales, August 1929. Let's see if I have some photos. It is considered the first true sword and sorcery story. It is also, by really no coincidence, probably the first, no, it was the second short story by Robert Howard that I read because, and I've just read it again recently because when I was growing up, I got into Conan through I got into Conan through the Roy Thomas, Barry Smith, and then later John Buscema comics. And then I tracked down the books. They were not in print. The Lancer, was it Lancer? The infamous Elspeth de Camp, Lynn Carter books were not in print and were hard to find where I was growing up in Nevada. But I did find a couple of them in British imports. Sphere was the publisher who published them, and through that I went with my allowance money or whatever it was. What would I've been? I think I was 15, 14 or 15. I ordered them. I ordered all of them, the complete dozen or whatever Conan books, and the one Kull book that was part of the series. The Conan all had black spines. The Kull one had sort of a greenish spine. I started with that because I figured, one book to start off with the characters. The first story in that book was called, at that time, was called Exile of Atlantis. It was a previously unpublished story. I mean, it wasn't published in Howard's lifetime, but it came out later. And in this current edition, this this Del Rey edition I'm reading, they just called it an untitled story because apparently Exile of Atlantis was just what Glenn Lord or whoever brought it to print decided to call it. Howard had not titled the draft, and it's a story that reading now I recollected quite well. It's a story of it is the story that, I guess, kind of the origin story of Cullen, that he gets exiled from Atlantis, hence the title, because of his behavior towards a sort of ruthless sort of mercy, act of ruthless mercy, I guess you would call it, that he does at the end of the story. I won't spoil it. So, but remembered very vividly that scene. But it was, even that story was nothing like the effect of the Shadow Kingdom on me, which really blew me away as a teenage boy, and still does. It's still a very powerful story. It is, Conan is the king of. He's there's some similarities to Conan, and that he's an exile warrior who becomes king of a foreign land. Let's see if I can get this to show here. Um, Here's the illustration from. I don't know if you can see that well. It's probably not going to show up that well. That's That's the splash page from the original Weird Tales edition. Anyway, he's a new king, similar to some of the Conan stories where Conan is a new king in Aquilonia. Kull is quite a different character than Conan, though. Um, in that he's very introspective. He is very, he's sort of, I guess you would say, priest-like or monk-like. There's several references in the few stories that there are of Kull, that he's not interested in women and that he's never had any kind of romantic attachments. I mean, you can read that a couple different ways. but definitely never really interested in that kind of thing. He's more interested in philosophical matters. I think there's a story in here called "The Mirrors of Tuzun Thune," who it's anyway. It's more of a psychological portrait of a complicated person than Conan, who's much more outwardly a superhero type guy. But the Shadow Kingdom, I thought the plot at the time, I still think this is amazing. It is, he's early in his kingdom, he gets approached by different, how would you put it, different officers of the court or whatever. Very quickly, he finds out that there is a secret shadow government that's been ruling Valusia for, I guess, thousands of years. They're the original rulers of the planet. They're snake-like. They're serpents, and they're shapeshifters. And they, oh, spoiler alert, sorry. Um, First, he sees a couple. His first inkling of it is outside his throne room or his bedchamber, whatever. There's a couple guards on duty. He sees his guards slumped over, and then he sees identical guards at the door. Uh, and then eventually he sees a creature that is identical to himself that he has to fight. Turns out to be a lizard person. He manages to defeat these. I keep calling them lizard people, but I think they're more like snakes or serpents. And he defeats them, or he at least fights them to a draw. He ends the story um, pledging to wipe them out completely, but he has not done this. There's this very vivid image of him driving a sword clear through the hilt to the entrance to this chamber where these lizard people live. And I started thinking about, all the conspiracy stuff that I love to read and that people are nuts about these days. And I did my usual deep scholarly research into one or two Wikipedia pages. And I was, not really surprised, but kind of pleasantly delighted or just found it interesting that this is, according to some people, this story is actually the source of those conspiracy theories that, or is credited as the source. I don't think it's quite true, though, and I'll go into that in a minute as soon as I find all my scholarly stuff here. Let's see. It's what they call the, I'm sure if you've been online a lot and the reptilian conspiracy theory is what it's called. It was, okay, this reptilians so this is all from Wikipedia, are supposedly reptilian humanoids who play a prominent role in fantasy, science fiction, ufology conspiracy theories. You hear people, Alex Jones and these kind of people talking about the lizard people, the serpents, and people in their skin suits and things like that. The idea of reptilians was popularized by David Icke, a conspiracy theorist who claims shape-shifting reptilian aliens control Earth by taking on human form and gaining political power to manipulate human societies. You've seen many expressions of this, and like the old TV show V, where the aliens come, they look like humans, but they get revealed they're actually scary lizard people in here. But I thought it was interesting that there's a guy, a professor at Syracuse called Michael Barkham, posits that the idea did originate with this story, the Shadow Kingdom. A story drew on theosophical ideas of the lost worlds of Atlantis and Lemuria, calls it Lemurian. But here's the thing where it's really not from, Howard didn't really originate the theory, because he took it possibly from Madame Blavatsky's The Secret Doctrine, 1888, with its references to dragon men who once had a mighty civilization on a Lemurian continent. So Howard really isn't the first person to think of a vast conspiracy of serpents disguised as men who rule in the shadows. But he might have read it. He might have came up with it on his own, or he might have, got inspired by Madame Blavatsky's book. So she's really probably as with many conspiracy things and occult things, she's one of those characters like, from that time in the late 19th century, with Aleister Crowley and all these people who influenced, so many people, so many writers and conspiracy theorists and cult creators. But I thought it was interesting, because we see, uh, to see that connection to something that's still in the world today. And it's a very effective story. It's not as well written as some of the later Cole stories. You can see, in my opinion, I think Howard's writing still a little bit rough around the edges. This is earlier than the Conan stories. He Another story later in the collection by this Axi Rule, which was also rejected by Weird Tales, but that Howard really later turned into the Phoenix on the Sword, the first Conan story, is Kull kind of breaking with traditional ideas of how to rule. And there's a lot of traditions in Valyria, and up till this point he's trying to conform to them. And there's this big battle axe on the wall, and he takes down to do his fighting of this demons, and he decides to become a different kind of leader. He's going to rule by his own lights, whereas there's this kind of tug and pull between uh, the established norms of losing the traditions of the country, and he decides at that point in by this Axi Rule that he's going to rule and be his own man. We don't know how far Howard planned to take all these things. There's really not as many of these stories as Conan, and I think he found Conan was a more versatile character. King Cole's kind of brooding. There's I don't know what story I would consider the best written. I think it is Shadow Kingdom, but the very next story is called The Mirrors of Tuzun Thune, where a wizard tricks Kull into going to this Hall of Mirrors and kind of um, has a bigger effect on Kull than he would have had on Conan. Conan would have just regarded this, but it kind of puts Kull's life in a whole different direction, where he sees himself uh, sort of nakedly in one of these mirrors. This kind of, he has a kind of an existential doubt about himself that maybe is somewhat mitigated by in the story by the Saxai Rule, but he is a darker, more brooding kind of character than Conan. I don't know if that reflects a different time in Howard's life, but Cole's always been a very complex, interesting character. Um, Not as popular as Conan, maybe because of that. Who knows? What else did I want to say? There's one other thing I wanted to say about this. Yeah, just going back to the idea of the political, the sort of the theory, the fantasy, whatever you want to call it, the popular delusion. Unfortunately, we can't put everything off on lunar people. We're stuck with humanity. It would be convenient to think that our fates are controlled by supernatural demons who secretly control. It would make more sense than what we see, where we've got, at least in the United States, we've got two political parties that don't seem to really work for the people. They seem to have other agendas of their own. I'm thinking of the vote recently, the vote on ICE. Democrats are allegedly against the funding of ICE, and yet somehow, there's this big vote on the budget of ICE. There's just this massive expansion on the vote for ICE, like upping it from 1 billion a year to 1.5 billion a year, I think it is. Obviously, the Republicans are for that. Not every single Republican is happy, of course, with what ICE is doing right now in Minnesota. and there were 7 votes short, so they needed 7 Democrats to cross the aisle and vote for the ICE budget. And guess how many Democrats managed to get to cross the aisle and vote for the ICE budget? 7, exactly what they needed. And the theory I see floating online, there's a theory that's been around for a while, specifically to the Democrats, called the rotating villain. I believe the first one this was applied to was Joe Lieberman, who was a conservative Democrat, who was always very reliable in voting with the Republicans and everything. Um, Most recently in the Senate, we've had in the last couple of sessions during the Biden administration, we had the 2 senators, Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema, who were sort of seemed like almost like double agents. They would always vote with the Republicans when they had to, when it was something that the Democrats had promised to do. For example, raising the national minimum wage to $15, but that they really didn't want to do. They would trot out one of these rotating villains to take it. And as Kristen Sinema, who I'm certainly no fan of, she's out of politics now. She's got her own sort of public sex scandal going on right now, but that's neither here nor there. But she was reliable in voting against her party when they needed her to, when they needed a scapegoat to do an unpopular vote. And as she said at one point, there are a lot of Democrats who are hiding behind my skirts, meaning she's out there and she's no longer part of the party. She decided not to run for re-election because she would have lost. She's out there to vote down the minimum wage because they needed that not to pass. So, I'm thinking about that with this recent vote on ICE, where the Democrats don't want to be seen as supporting ICE, but yet they do want to support ICE because they want to go along to get along. I don't know what their reasons are. They don't want to. They don't want to take the heat from the right of holding up this spending bill. So they pick. This is the idea of the rotating villain. They pick. Look, you 7 people are in safe seats. You're going to vote for this bill. This would be leadership telling this, Democratic leadership telling this, and then you'll take the heat on this one, but next time we'll pick someone else to take the heat on it, so you don't have all the bad votes. You saw this a couple of years ago with AOC crying and voting for the Iron Dome in Israel. I know some of this stuff is really not what people want to hear about or pay attention to, and so I don't want to hold up everybody's time to explain all these, but the Iron Dome was a bill for money for defense for Israel, enabling them to continue their Gaza, their war in Gaza, and AOC was on the scene on the floor crying because she voted for it, because Nancy Pelosi needed at least one more vote from the squad to pass the Iron Dome bill. So she designated at that time AOC to do it, and they have to eat shit, some of them, because the Democrats don't work for the people any more than the Republicans do. They both work for the oligarchs. Okay, so this is the kind of thing that happens that lead people to believe in vast conspiracies, like about lizards who have another agenda, their own agenda for running the country, and that we are just kind of bystanders. And it's a very interesting metaphor. Obviously not true, but you can see how it appears in pop culture, because it makes a kind of strange sense. This is the kind of thing that the not the Tea Party. Who was it? Not the Tea Party. Who came after the Tea Party on the right? The people who went in with, the people who thought JFK Jr. was actually going to come back to life. And I gotta look that up. QAnon. That's who I was trying to think of. You can see when the government is so when we're kind of all on the outside looking in, and it's so strange sometimes how our government proceeds in sort of a mysterious way, and how nothing that they run on ever seems to get done, and a lot of stuff that nobody wants done. Nobody was really crying for the capture of Maduro. Well, the Democrats were, because they put a bounty on his head 2 years ago, but they didn't want actually anyone to go and do it. So, but these conspiracies, they come back all the time because I think they speak to something sort of primal in human in the human imagination. There's a bunch of them listed here on this Wikipedia page. It mentions the Men in Black series, V, They Live, the John Carpenter movie. You said they keep coming over and over. So I got more in the weeds on that I intended to. Another clip I see a lot of times online is Putin talking, and of course he has an agenda why he would want to frame things this way, but it is still an interesting quote. There is a quote of him being interviewed somewhere where he talks about what happens to American presidents. He goes, every American president, each new president comes in and they have these lofty goals. And this is from his point of view. I'm not endorsing it. I'm just repeating it. Each American president comes in, they have things they want to do, and things they want to do on the world stage, things they want to do at home. And then Putin says, he goes, and then the men in the dark suits show up and they tell him how it's going to be. And that's not the most implausible idea, as far as I'm concerned. If you look at the different, if you look at the defense state, the sort of the permanent bureaucratic class of Washington, the CIA has always seemed to have their own agenda, and they work hard to swing a president around to that agenda, and they usually end up winning. Whatever you think of Trump, I don't think he wanted to get into a bunch of wars. I really think when he started, he thought just by the force of his charm and personality and his rather simplistic, I would have to say, worldview, that he would be able to solve all these wars if people do what he wanted, because the United States is so powerful. And now he's supporting the same Israeli program. He's really doing nothing either way in Ukraine, and he's toppling South American countries. So it seems to have it seems the government of the empire, or whatever you want to call it. If you don't want to believe it's an empire, that's fine. The government seems to have its own agenda that barrels forward generation after generation. It doesn't turn around. It goes, sometimes it gets slowed down a little bit, and sometimes it goes full bore, like it seems to be going lately. But we'll see what happens. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to get all conspiracy theory out this, but I really believe the story, the Shadow Kingdom, does really lend to that, because it is exactly that kind of situation in the legendary fictional world of King Kull. So I also read for this month's Howard reading, I read Almuric. I'll talk about that briefly because I don't have much to say about it. Almuric is a early Howard story, the novella, short novel that was not published in his lifetime, I don't believe, which is a pastiche of Edgar Rice Burroughs, the Mars stories. I really enjoyed the setup for it. I thought it was very funny because it was a bit ridiculous, which is fair, because that's kind of the hallmark of that genre, the genre of a person being transported to an alien world, which is very much like, which has fanciful creatures and sword play instead of gunplay, and so there's this. It starts out the first chapter or so. There's this scientist who, in a way, I like the voice of the scientist the way Howard wrote it. The voice of this scientist who has discovered a way to get to a distant planet, which he's not going to go into for the purposes of the story, but he figures out a way to go to a distant planet called Almeric. And then he has a friend who shows up who's in trouble with the mob, like a tough guy, a Howard type, uh, hard Scrabble, tough Texas rural country, hard fighting man hero. And of course, what do they decide to do? Well, he's got to get away from the mob who's after him, is going to kill him. So just send him to this other planet. And it works out very well because the guy loves it there because he meets a maiden or a princess or whatever. Gets a lot of sword fights, defeats everybody, becomes a warlord. Very fun story. Next week, I will be beginning. Next week will be February, and I'll be reading the first of the 3 Del Rey Conan collections. I think it's called The Coming of the or Conan the Cimmerian or something. I won't look it up. You know what it is. I'm going to read those over the next 3 months: February, March, April. May, I'm going to read the collected horror fiction of Howard for Horror Mayhem. That will leave me with only one left, El Barak, which I'm really looking forward to. I think it's going to be smooth sailing the rest of the way now because I love Conan already. I don't think there's many of the major stories I haven't read before. Then maybe 1 or 2. I don't really think so, though. So I know I'm going to love those. I know I'm going to love his horror stories from the few I've read before. There's quite a number of them that I haven't read, though. So I'm very excited for the rest of the Conan year. After I read El Barak, that'll be May, June. Then over the summer, I'm going to read the 2 Howard biographies that came out recently. So maybe I'll have more to say about Robert Howard then. Okay, that's enough for this. Didn't mean to go off on all that political stuff, but I think it's interesting. I think it's interesting that trope keeps coming back in popular culture. It's very big now. Probably best if it stayed in popular culture and not in the political discourse. But that's the world we are in. We're kind of in a absurd hyper reality where things come so fast that it's hard to tell fiction from fact sometimes. All right, talk to you later.